Tonight we're here on a particular important topic of Japanese-Canadian internment and dispersal. I am going to start with a short introduction, just to announce from the outset. It's not happy news, but it is clear news. I'm afraid that Joy Kogawa is home ill this evening and will be unable to join us. You will see a video presentation that she made by camera that we will be showing after my comments. But we also have, in special note, we have a get well card for Joy by this table over here. And if you'd please join us in signing it, I think she would really appreciate to know your good wishes. I don't think, it's funny how it takes a community to raise a community. But Joy Kogawa's contribution to bringing the insight to the situation of Japanese Canadians is a special one, and deserves our continued gratitude and thanks. So if you could please join us in signing that card tonight, we would all appreciate that. So my name is David. I've lived a pretty charmed life. Even when I worked in precarious jobs in factories, as a tobacco picker, among the homeless, and as a laborer, my male white skin privilege always gave me material power that others did not have. The maltreatment of Japanese Canadians by the Canadian state, though, deserves a special place of recognition within our country, not only for the degree of subjugation, but also for its ongoing impact that it's had for Japanese Canadians even today. I'm going to give a quick review of some of the history of internment and dispersal, and a short, brief history of the community in Toronto. First Japanese-Canadian immigrant to Canada, Manzo Nagano from Nagasaki, settled and raised his family in Victoria, BC in 1877. Toronto in the early 1900s, Kenji Ijikawa and Shigesapuro Ubagato ran a silk business, and back in 1910, the assistant curator at ROM was Takatsuna Kurata. By the early 1900s, there was a significant Japanese-Canadian community across a number of centers in BC. But this was the change between the two centuries back then. In the 1800s, the Japanese Canadians, like the Chinese and later other Eastern European immigrants, were seen as cheap labor. By the 1900s, racist attitudes started to develop based on labor and land and business protectionism. A note of that was the Vancouver riots in 1907. And we're a labor group, so it's important that we acknowledge some of this history. On July 24th of 1907, a boat landed in Vancouver with 1,200 Japanese on board. Tensions started to rise among the white community with accusations that they were going to be overrun. Even the Attorney General of BC joined in with false warnings. In particular, what I want to note was the Vancouver Trades and Labor Council met and set up the Asiatic Exclusion League. And on September 7th, on Powell Street, a 5,000 mob riot took place, attacking both the Chinatown that existed and the Japantown that existed. I think it's appropriate to note, though, that Little Tokyo, a lot of it was, the damage there was stopped as residents of Little Tokyo defended themselves against the mob. Mackenzie King was assigned to come in and review the damage. And one of his recommendations was to restrict immigration of Japanese Canadians to be laborers. In World War I, it's important to note that 200 Japanese Canadians volunteered to fight in World War I. And the returning Japanese Canadian vets were not granted the right to vote until 12 years after their return. This was a vote that was not granted to other Japanese Canadians. Now, I just want to talk a little bit general about internment, just so we're clear on this. The Canadian state has used internment on a regular basis. During World War I, 8,500 people were interned in 24 camps across Canada. It was mostly Austro-Hungarians and Germans. And to take note, those that, I mean, what happened in the wartime, there was labor shortages, and so a number of the internees were released to work in mines and in farms. But those not released to work were deported at the end of World War I. During World War I, there was organizing against conscription, and the federal government's response was to outlaw mostly left organizations. But they also outlawed, by the way, the Chinese Nationalist League. The debate between employers and the Canadian state at that time was based on the difference between labor shortages and militant trade unions. If there was militant trade unions, the employers wanted the non-British born people deported. If there was labor shortages, the employers were fine in them continuing to work. By the way, we did a session recently, Toronto Workers' History Project, on Emma Goldman in Toronto. In 1908, she went to Winnipeg. By 1910, the federal government had changed the Immigration Act to ensure that any new immigrants coming into Canada that had anarchist or socialist viewpoints could be deported. And during the 1920s and 1930s, the common response to militant labor organizing was the deportation of so-called enemy aliens, including the majority, by the way, were deported were from England, Scotland, and Ireland. So in the 1940s, there was 22,000 Japanese Canadians living in BC. And at the December 7th, 1941, a date that most of us know either through Hollywood or through history, Pearl Harbor took place. And immediately, schools and newspapers of Japanese Canadians were shut down. There were fishing boats, automobiles, properties, and businesses were seized. Their radios and cameras were confiscated, and a curfew was imposed from dusk to dawn. In February 1942, the federal government ordered the evacuation of all Japanese from the West Coast. And RCMP officers entered homes at all hours of the night and day. People were given only hours to move. By March 4th, they set up an administration to administer the evacuation. Many who had resisted were sent the furthest away from BC. So a location that some of us know, close to Marathon, Ontario, at that point it was called Angler, Ontario, most of the people that resisted the putting in internment were sent to that camp. And some of the people resisting were only resisting because male family leads were taken away from their families. And a number of them just wanted to go as families. Others just resisted the whole idea of the internment. Others resisted just because of all the things that were seized. There is a telling photo that you can see of all the fishing boats the Japanese Canadian community had at the time, all round up in Vancouver Harbor, seized by the government. A great account, historical account, almost a week-by-week account, is the Terry Watada book, The Three Pleasures, written recently, 2017, and I would encourage you, if you can get a copy, it's a very important book. But by March 1943, as in World War I, there were wartime labor shortages, and a number of the internees were released to work in the logging camps and, ironically, sugar beet farms in Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. The war ended in 1945, but Japanese Canadians continued to be subject to controls of War Measures Act for another 4 years. Now, in terms of the dispersal policy, Mackenzie King stated in 1944, "It's a fact that no person of Japanese race born in Canada has been charged with any act of sabotage or disloyalty during the years of war." But by the election of 1945, he'd forgotten that comment. And he's the one who set in the new policy of dispersal towards the community. The United States allowed Japanese Americans to return to the West Coast, but in Canada, Japanese Canadians were not allowed to return to the West Coast until 1949. And so what it meant was all the other members of the community were either scattered or asked if they would choose to be deported. And this then became the struggle of the time. There were a number that agreed to be deported. A number of the older members of the community chose to go back to Japan, and their younger family members chose to go with them. By the way, it's interesting to note that some of those younger family members then returned to Canada subsequently. But at the time, this was the government's option: deport or be dispersed. And so a campaign started. By the way, there was a Chicago academic, Forrest E. Lavalette, who did a review of the treatment of Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians in 1948. It's an interesting read. He said the Canadian state encouraged the forced dispersal to make use of Japanese labor during the wartime shortages and to minimize expenses incurred from the internment. That was his comment. By the way, another important book, and again, I'm going to ask the Toronto Workers' History Project to place a lot of these resources on our website, just in case you want to follow up on any of this history. But of course, the book by Ann Sunahara, Politics or Racism, she, earlier in her life, was not aware of this history until 1971. Her husband, a Japanese Canadian, David, was looking at the television coverage of the Quebec crisis and the War Measures Act imposed in Quebec. And his one comment was, "I guess I'm waiting for them to start rounding people up and put them into camps again like they did to us." And that's when Ann Sunahara became aware much more deeply of the history that Japanese Canadians went through in World War II. And she wrote that fabulous book, did detailed history. And by the way, one of the reasons of the excellence of the history is a lot of the documents from the time were finally released after 30 years so that she could complete her work. I'm just going to go on a little bit longer because, again, we have some other important contributions. 1947, the BC Elections Act came up for revisions. Japanese Canadian residents of British Columbia had not been allowed to vote up until that point. And they still weren't allowed to vote until 1948, where they were granted the right to vote along with Indigenous people of BC. By March 31st of 1949, the wartime restrictions were lifted and Japanese Canadians were allowed to vote in the federal election. Now, the one piece I'm going to finish with is just around the fight around the deportation, because it's fascinating that in Toronto, of course, people were dispersed from the camps. And so the community, which hadn't been large in Toronto, started to grow. It also started to organize. And so January 10th of 1946 at Jarvis Collegiate, there was 1,000 people, mostly Japanese Canadians, who were organizing around the forced deportations. This included Rabbi Feinberg and the Saturday night editor B.K. Sandwell and 2 Liberal senators. The only media support at the time was the Toronto Star and the Vancouver Province, and then there was a subsequent meeting at U of T in February 1946, and this effectively, along with a Supreme Court action by Andrew Bruen, made the federal government blink around this action, and they finally relented to stop the deportation, particularly when they started to note that there was a polling done of Canadians that said that Canadians were in favor of them not being deported. They were in favor of the deportations being stopped. And so the Liberal Party, similar to the Liberal Party today, read the tea leaves of the polls and stopped the deportations. The only other thing I want to mention, just because of how close we are, in August 1947, delegates, Japanese Canadian delegates from Ontario, BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec formed the Japanese Canadian Citizens Association with Roger Obata as the first president and Toronto as the interim headquarters. And 800 people filled the Labour Lyceum over on Spadina. And to hear Mike Masuka of the Japanese American Citizens League during the formation of the association. My last comment before we move, and again, it's another personal one. I was lucky enough to visit Japan in the late 80s, early 90s as part of organizing against homelessness in Toronto. And I met Japanese activists in Japan who are concerned with the status and the situation of Korean Japanese. And what they wanted to use. They wanted to use the maltreatment of Japanese Canadians to pressure the Japanese government to stop the maltreatment of Korean Japanese. That was fascinating for me and opened my eyes to a whole other level of the international impact of this situation. So, without further ado, we are now I'm going to introduce our speakers when we get to them, but first we are going to see a video of Joy Kogawa, taken at her home, I believe, reading from her infamous book, Obasan.
My name is Joy Kogawa. I'm reading from Obasan. This is the prologue. There is a silence that cannot speak. There is a silence that will not speak. Beneath the grass, the speaking dreams, and beneath the dreams is a sensate sea. The speech that frees comes forth from that amniotic deep. To attend its voice, I can hear it say, is to embrace its absence. But I fail the task. The word is stone. I admit it. I hate the stillness. I hate the stone. I hate the sealed vault with its cold icon. I hate the staring into the night, the questions thinning into space, the sky swallowing the echoes. Unless the stone bursts with telling, unless the seed flowers with speech, there is in my life no living word. The sound I hear is only sound, white sound. Words, when they fall, are pockmarks on the earth. They are hailstones, seeking an underground stream. If I could follow the stream down and down to the hidden voice, would I come at last to the freeing word? I ask the night sky, but the silence is steadfast. There is no reply. The next excerpt is from chapter 15, where Naomi is remembering the time that everybody was being sent away on trains into the interior. Chapter 15. I am sometimes not certain whether it's a cluttered attic in which I sit, a waiting room, a tunnel, a train. There's no beginning and no end to the forest or the dust storm, no edge from which to know where the clearing begins. Here, in this familiar density, beneath this cloak, within this carapace, is the longing within the darkness. 1942. We are leaving the BC coast. Rain, cloud, mist, an air overladen with weeping. Behind us lies a salty sea, within which swim our drowning specks of memory, our small, waterlogged eulogies. We are going down to the middle of the earth with pickaxe eyes, tunneling by train to the interior, carried along by the momentum of the expulsion into the waiting wilderness. We are hammers and chisels in the hands of the would-be sculptors, battering the spirit of the sleeping mountain. We are the chips and sand, the fragments that fly like arrows from the heart of the rock. We are the silences that speak from a stone. We are the despised, rendered voiceless, stripped of car, radio, camera, and every means of communication. A trainload of eyes covered with mud and spittle. We are the man in the Gospel of John, born into the world for the sake of the light. We are sent to Siloam, the pool called Sent. We are sent to the sending that we may bring sight. We are the scholarly and the illiterate, the envied and the ugly, the fierce and the docile. We are those pioneers who cleared the bush and the forest with our hands, the gardeners tending and attending the soil with our tenderness, the fishermen who are flung from the sea to flounder in the dust of the prairies. We are the Issei and the Nisei and the Sansei, the Japanese Canadians. We disappear into the future, undemanding as dew. The next part is an excerpt from chapter 29, Aunt Emily's memories and Naomi's memories of our time in Alberta. There's a folder in Aunt Emily's package containing only one newspaper clipping and an index card with the words, "Facts about evacuees in Alberta." The newspaper clipping has a photograph of one family, all smiles, standing around a pile of beets. The caption reads, "Grinning and happy. Find Jap evacuees' best beet workers." Lethbridge, Alberta, January 22. Japanese evacuees from British Columbia supplied the labor for 65% of Alberta's sugar beet acreage last year. Phil Baker of Lethbridge, president of the Alberta Sugar Beet Growers Association, stated today, "They played an important part in producing our all-time record crop of 363 tons of beets in 1945, he added. Mr. Baker explained Japanese evacuations worked 19,500 acres of beets, and German prisoners of war worked 5,000 acres. The labor for the remaining 5,500 acres of Alberta's 30,000 acres of sugar beets was provided by farmers and their families. Some of the heaviest beet yields last year came from farms employing Japanese evacuees. Generally speaking, Japanese evacuees have developed into most efficient beet workers, many of them even better than the transient workers who cared for beets in southern Alberta before Pearl Harbor. Facts about evacuees in Alberta. The fact is, I never got used to it, and I cannot bear the memory. There are some nightmares from which there is no waking, only deeper and deeper sleep. There's a word for it: hardship. The hardship is so pervasive, so inescapable, so thorough. It's a noose around my chest and I cannot move anymore. All the oil in my joints is drained out, and I have been invaded by dust and grit from the fields, and mud is in my bone marrow. I can't move anymore. My fingernails are black from scratching the scorching day, and there's no escape. Aunt Emily, are you a surgeon cutting at my scalp with your folders and your filing cards and your insistence on knowing all? The memory drains down the sides of my face, but it isn't enough, is it? It's your hands in my abdomen pulling the growth from the lining of my walls. But bring back the anesthetist. Turn on the ether, clamp down the gas mask, bring on the chloroform. Where would this operation be over, Aunt Em? Is it so bad? Yes. Do I really mind? Yes, I mind. I mind everything, even the flies. Flies and flies and flies from the cows in the barn and the manure pile. All the black flies that curtain the windows, and Obasan with a wad of toilet paper, spish, then with her hands as well, grabbing them and their shocking white eggs, and the mosquitoes mixed there with the other insect corpses around the base of the gas lamp. It's a chicken coop house we live in that I mind. The uninhabited, unbelievable, thin as a cotton dress hovel, never before inhabited in winter by human beings. In summer, it's a heat trap, an incubator, a dry sauna from which there is no relief. In winter, the icicles drip down the inside of the windows, and the ice is thicker than bricks at the ledge. The only place that is warm is by the coal stove, where we rotate like chickens on a spit, and the feet are so cold they stop registering. We eat cloves of roasted garlic on winter nights to warm up. I'll read that. We eat cloves of roast garlic on winter nights to warm up. It's the bed bugs. Am I having to sleep on the table to escape the nightly attack and the welts over our bodies and all the swamp bugs and the dust? It's Obasan uselessly packing all the cracks with rags and the muddy water from the irrigation ditch, which we strain and settle and boil, and the tiny carcasses of water creatures at the bottom of cups. It's walking in winter through the reservoir and keeping the hole open with the axe and dragging up the water in pails and lugging it back, and sometimes the water will spill down your boots and your feet are red and itchy for days, and it's everybody taking a bath in the round galvanized tub. Then Obasan washing clothes in the water after and standing outside hanging the clothes in the freezing weather where everything instantly stiffens the lines. Or standing in the beef field under the maddening sun, standing with my black head a sun trap, even though it's covered, and lying out in the ditch, faint, and the nausea and waves, and the cold sweat, and getting up and tackling the next row. The whole field is an oven, and there's not a tree within walking distance. We're tiny as insects crawling along the grill, and there's no protection anywhere. The eyes are lidded against the dust, and the air cracks the skin. The lips crack. Stephen's flutes crack, and there's no energy to sing anymore anyway. It's standing in the field and staring out at the heat waves that waver and shimmer like see-through curtains over the brown clods and over the tiny, distant bodies of Stephen and Uncle and Obasan, miles away across the field, day after day, and not even wondering how this has come about. This next excerpt is from chapter 34, in the conversation with Mrs. Sparker. The comments are so incessant and always so well-intentioned. How long have you been in this country? Do you like our country? You speak such good English. Do you run a cafe? My daughter has a darling Japanese friend. Have you ever been back to Japan? Back? Does it so much matter that these questions are always asked, particularly by strangers? These are icebreaker questions that create an awareness of ice.
So now we're going to hear from Susan Ihoshi. She is a third-generation Japanese Canadian. She was born in Toronto to parents who were forced to leave their Vancouver homes in 1942 and eventually settled here. She studied English literature at U of T and has worked in publishing most of her career. The research and writing of her first book, Torn Apart, which we have copies at the back for sale as well, and they're also signed.
Yes.
A fictional diary for young adults based on real historical events experienced by her own family, finally opened her eyes to her own heritage. She now knows that history is not simply what happened in the past, it's what we choose to remember. And when I asked Susan what how she'd want me to describe what she was going to say tonight. She said, I am taking a personal approach to the history of the internment. I'm going to explain how I at last connected to my Japanese Canadian heritage after decades of being unable to acknowledge it.
Good evening, everyone. As David mentioned, I'm a third-generation Japanese Canadian. I once believed that being born here, educated at U of T, marrying a WASP, and working for Canadian businesses made me belong to the white majority. Decades passed before I realized how deluded I was. The long overdue recognition of my Japanese heritage set me on a journey I will travel for the rest of my life. Tonight, I'll share with you how my perspective changed. As David mentioned, I worked in the Canadian publishing industry, and some years ago, I left my job as an editor, hoping to do some writing. I struggled to find inspiration, so I asked a former manager for advice. He suggested that I write about the history of Japanese Canadians. In fact, he thought I should write something for Scholastic Canada, a publisher of books for young people. Scholastic has an acclaimed series of fictional diaries about real historic events, so his proposal seemed ideal. Surely that topic had already been covered, I said. No, he replied. He was pretty sure it hadn't, and he put me in touch with Scholastic. That's why in 2009, I found myself with a book contract and a lot of research to do. It seemed the perfect time for me to talk with family members who actually experienced those long ago World War II events. Until then, I never thought to ask them about the past. I am grateful that I did, because this personal connection finally made me see my own history. My grandparents were deceased by this time, and my father had died when I was 14. But my mother and most of my aunts and uncles were still alive and willing to talk to me, perhaps because their parents, the first generation who'd come to Canada from Japan, were no longer around. This second generation felt free to talk openly. Much of what they said surprised and shocked me and became material I used in my book. Besides interviewing my relatives, I read as much as I could on Japanese Canadians and their history. I began meeting other Japanese Canadians for the first time outside my own family, including BC activist Mary Kitagawa. She was the force behind the University of British Columbia granting honorary degrees to its Japanese Canadian students unable to graduate in 1942 after being declared enemy aliens. When she first approached UBC in 2008, they denied such a thing ever happened. Astonished at the university's ignorance, I realized I wasn't the only person with historical amnesia. Thanks to Mary's persistence, UBC fully acknowledged its mistake. 76 former students were honored in a moving graduation ceremony I was privileged to witness in 2012, coincidentally the same year my book was published. In 2013, a fascinating 6-part article appeared in the Vancouver Sun called Merciful Injustice. It described how 26-year-old Yoshiyuki Uno was killed during a robbery of his parents' Vancouver confectionery store by a gang of white youths in January 1942. The leader was a Canadian soldier, so the gang's capture and subsequent trial in the period after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor received front-page coverage. When all the gang members were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, the papers had a field day voicing opposing views of whether justice had been served. That first trial took place in April 1942. The lawyer for the gang leader successfully appealed to the Supreme Court for a new trial. By fall of that year, all Japanese Canadians living in BC's coastal areas were forcibly uprooted and detained in isolated areas of the province. To testify at the second trial in April 1943, members of the victim's family had to travel from their wooden shack in BC's remote interior back to Vancouver. No longer front-page news, this trial's outcome was barely noted in the papers of the time. Who cared about one dead Jap when all enemy aliens had been removed from the coast and sent elsewhere. In the copious research I'd done earlier, I'd never encountered this story. Kudos to journalist Stuart Muir for uncovering and restoring it to public attention. I now say that I care because I recognize how the Uno family's tragic story is that of my entire community, and it's why it forms the basis of the book I'm currently working on. So Pearl Harbor was just a catalyst for the eruption of long-standing racial discrimination against Japanese Canadians in BC, some of which David described. Their uprooting, incarceration, and dispersal amounted to ethnic cleansing. 22,000 Japanese Canadians had to leave their homes and businesses in 1942. Men were ordered to road camps to do hard labor, while women and children were shipped to detention centers, euphemistically called internment camps, by the government. To avoid being split up, some Japanese Canadians worked on sugar beet farms in the prairies and elsewhere. They endured back-breaking labor, meager pay, and inhumane housing conditions, such as abandoned chicken coops without potable water, as Joy described. In 1943, the BC Security Commission began selling off the properties and belongings of Japanese Canadians without their permission, using the proceeds to pay for the owner's incarceration. By January 45, those in the camps were forced to disperse again. They had to choose between so-called repatriation, or as David described it, was deportation, a country to Japan, a country the majority had never seen before, or leave BC altogether and go east of the Rockies. Most decided to make their way across the country and begin their lives over. Many came to Ontario, with the largest numbers eventually settling in what is now known as the GTA. It's hard to imagine the obstacles they faced. The city of Toronto was not a welcoming place. The mayor, Frederick Conboy, and the Board of Control passed a bylaw banning Japanese Canadians from 1942 to 1945. Those wanting to work and live here had to appeal to the mayor or else find a sponsor. Among numerous petitions still found in the City of Toronto archives today is one from May 12, 1945. Lawyer George Scroggie wrote on behalf of one Robert Hoyta, who needed permission to move from Islington to Toronto. A Canadian citizen, Hoyta was a World War I veteran who fought at Passchendaele, and his son was actively serving with the Canadian Army overseas after finally being allowed to join in January of 45. Mayor Robert Saunders replied to Scroggie that a considerable number of these people have already taken up residence in the city, and it is inadvisable to permit more to come, at least while the war with Japan is in progress. These disheartening facts came from an exhibit I saw last year called Redefining Home at historic Campbell House. It told the story of Harold and Hannah Kawasoe, both born in Victoria, BC, who met and married after they came to Toronto. Unable to find accommodation, the couple made their first home in the attic of Campbell House from 1948 to 1951 with the help of Harold's employer, friend, and ally, C.F. Wood. The building was then being used as a glassmaking company owned by Wood, one of a small number of people opposed to the government's treatment of Japanese Canadians. He hired Harold and his brother Mitz as landscape gardeners for his own home, and during the war employed up to 100 Japanese Canadians at one of his other companies. My father and uncle also came here seeking work. Uncle Barney described how difficult it was to find lodging as people of Japanese heritage were turned away from boarding houses. My mother and her two sisters found their first accommodation in Toronto on Church Street. Their kind Irish landlord belonged to another immigrant group with a shared history of being unwanted. In spite of the wartime labor shortage, employment was limited for Japanese Canadians. My father and uncle were offered menial work at a bandage factory, tearing strips of gauze into pieces. The job was so mind-numbing, they both quit shortly after starting. My mother and her friend Aki, who turns out to be Kim's aunt, went from living in primitive shacks to working as domestic servants in the palatial mansion of wealthy Toronto businessman Nelson Davis. My Aunt Tomiko's search for work in Toronto was as frustrating as my father's and uncle's, but she eventually was hired at a Jewish-owned dress shop. My Uncle Nick, too, described how the Jewish businesses on Spadina gave him his first work here, which eventually became his lifelong career. I must mention another friend and ally of Japanese Canadians. Macklin Hancock is celebrated today as the designer of Toronto's first planned urban community of Don Mills. But before that, he helped the Ihoshi family establish a foothold here. The Hancocks owned Woodland Nurseries in Port Credit, now part of Mississauga. Mac not only hired my Uncle Barney and other Japanese Canadians to work there, but he gave my uncle a parcel of land on which the Ihoshi family built a small house. The Hancocks remained my uncle's lifelong friends, and my cousin Ruth still resides in the same small house. On April 1st, 1949, Japanese Canadians were finally allowed to vote and given the freedom to move anywhere in Canada. With limited resources, few returned to BC where they had endured such hardships. Most remained here to establish new lives and new families, and is why I was born here. In 1977, Japanese Canadians marked the centenary of the arrival of the first official immigrant from Japan, as David mentioned, letting them openly express pride in their heritage for the first time since World War II. This emerging self-confidence also led to the formation of a redress movement, whose efforts resulted in an official apology by the federal government in 1988, along with some financial compensation. However, it wasn't until 2012 that British Columbia offered a weak expression of regret for its past actions against Japanese Canadians. Our community is currently seeking a fuller apology from the province, as well as tangible ways to memorialize past injustices so they won't be forgotten. My grandparents and parents understandably wished to move beyond the past and to become part of mainstream Canadian society. However, the resulting assimilation has almost erased our cultural identity in my generation and after. There is also the real danger of society's ignorance of those past events, as we saw with UBC, or else a belief that they won't happen again to other racial groups. And I'll end by saying, as David said, that I really believe that history is not simply what happened in the past. It's what we choose to remember. Thank you.
To hear from Kim Koyama. He is a third-generation Japanese Canadian, born and raised in Toronto. He became involved in political activism in 2004 when he began to see parallels between the World War II internment of Japanese Canadians, including his parents and grandparents, and the current-day false accusations of terrorism made against Muslims. He continues to speak out against racism and all other forms of oppression, and he's now going to talk about the history of the internment and its lasting impact on the community.
Okay, so I have some recollections of my mother's experience during the internment, and I find that these experiences are really important to discuss because that's what makes the abstract meaningful. That's how people actually come to understand what it was like during the internment. But mainly I'd like to sort of zoom out and talk about the whole framework of what our government has done and continues to do, and how this impacts other groups, how these kinds of things are repeating and continue to happen. So a general overview, as quickly as I can. Once Pearl Harbor was bombed, the American and Canadian governments were afraid that if the Japanese invaded the west coast of North America, that the Japanese, Canadians, and Americans would assist the invaders, which makes very little sense. 3/4 of the population were people like my parents and uncles and aunts who had never been to Japan. This was their home. And the first generation were people who came to Canada to build a new life. And this was their adopted land. One thing that I find ironic and significant is that when you talk about first generation, second generation, and so on, most cultures regard the first generation as the generation first born here. But the Japanese community and a few others regard the first generation as the generation to arrive, the generation that adopts this as their own country. So that's built into the language. Issei is the first generation. That was all my grandparents who immigrated here. Nisei is the first generation born here. That's my parents and aunts and uncles. And I'm Sensei, third generation. So I think we probably know a little bit about the basics of the internment and what happened. The thing that's interesting is that I like talking to Americans about this because a lot of Americans are aware of the history of the Japanese-American internment and have no idea that the same thing happened in Canada. And as with many things, the Canadian government followed and imitated a lot of what the American government did. So the history of the Japanese, American, and Canadian internments are very similar. Although Canada has this reputation as kinder and gentler, and in this instance, I think this is one example where the Canadian government was actually a little bit harsher, because I believe, I've heard that, the American government tried to keep the families together, but in Canada, the families were split apart. So the heads of households were the first ones to be taken away. They were sent to labor and road camps. Shortly after that, they took the adult males, so the older, 18 and older, so my older uncles were sent to labor and road camps, but different ones. So now the families were split into three. And then they took some of the people who were in the labor camps and sent them into the BC interior to construct the internment camps. So here are people with not necessarily any carpentry experience, slapping together these wooden shacks at breakneck speed in order to prepare for the women and children. And then the women and children were evacuated. They were given very little notice and were allowed to take one suitcase of belongings. And they were taken into the interior. And in the case of my mother's family, interned in Tashmi, that was where there had been just empty land, and then these wooden shacks were put in rows, and that's where they lived. And so those conditions were pretty bleak. What's interesting, though, is that the more I find out about the internment experiences, the more I find wide differences in what people have experienced, particularly between Japanese, Canadians, and Americans. In the U.S., where the climate was milder, I've heard that some of the internment camps were tents. Whereas in the BC interior, that was impossible because it's not like Vancouver, it gets very, very cold. So, their experiences were things like having the wind blow right through the cracks between the boards, waking up with, frost on the inside of the ceiling and walls. There were water pumps outside, which were shared between every so many shacks. And they would pump water every day for their needs, but they always had to remember to put some aside so that they could get up in the morning, boil the water, and then go outside and pour it over the pump to thaw it out so they could have water for that day. So I believe it was my grandmother, my mother and her two sisters, and two younger brothers who were in this shack. The three girls slept in one bed, and they huddled around a hot water bottle in the winter. That was like, the experience of having to get through the cold weather. Again, as I said, the conditions were quite different. There were some places where they used ghost towns, where there was some existing infrastructure they could build on. In other cases, they used horse stables. And in Vancouver, there actually is a stable where it was used, I believe, as a staging area as people were being moved out of Vancouver. And so families were put in these horse stalls, one family to a stall, no privacy, just like three walls, no ceiling, incredibly difficult to sleep or to concentrate because there's no protection from the noise from all the other people. The one thing that is forgotten among these accounts, if you do a Google search, you can find some of these accounts and you can read the different experiences, but the one thing that I find often gets left out is that it's easy for us to try and imagine what they were going through when you hear some of the details of only being allowed one suitcase and being split up from families and so on and so on. But the one thing that's forgotten is that no one had any idea how long this was going to be for. And the government was actually regarding the imprisonment as indefinite. So considering that, your world's just fallen apart, you've lost everything, everything's been taken away from you, you're being sent into a prison camp with barbed wire and armed guards. Imagine trying to deal with this and not knowing how long this is going to be for. Is it going to be for the rest of your life? At that point, that might not have been an unreasonable expectation. So these kinds of things are pretty horrendous. Again, because the government was regarding it as indefinite, they were having to make provisions for education and medicine. And I just learned something last night as I was reading an account that was given to me by my cousin's daughter. Apparently my cousin was born in one of the internment camps, and the doctor who delivered him was a doctor who had lost his license in PC because of alcohol abuse. But because they needed doctors and teachers, that's who got the job. Wow. Which is, I know, it's incredible. But then think about today, the conditions that refugees in the US are enduring in these camps, in these cages. We're seeing the same kinds of things. One of my mother's most painful experiences was public bathing. So in Tashmi, there were 2 bathhouses, one for men and one for women. And I guess she was about 13 years old, and in order to bathe every few days, they were having to go on to use these public bathhouses. And I wrote about this. I have an article on rebel.ca. You can find it if you Google my name. And it goes over the history of the internment in relation to security measures, modern day security measures. I mentioned this, the bathhouse experience, and how humiliating it was for my mother. And one of my friends sent me a message and said, but I don't understand, in Japan, bathhouses are supposed to be very pleasurable experiences. Yes, that's true, when it's an optional experience. If you're a tourist going to Japan, it's something to do, you can't miss it, it's wonderful, that's great. But when you are a 13-year-old girl who's just been forced into a prison camp, and every few days you have to go and stand up in front of a bunch of strangers and take your clothes off. It's incredibly humiliating. And so this was, one of the worst memories that she has. A couple of years at a Christmas party, someone brought up the experience of the internment and was asking me questions about it. And he meant well, but he brought up something that I have actually seen in print, which is a quote from someone who was interned saying, it wasn't such a bad experience. So there's an important context around that, which is that it wasn't the Holocaust. And no one should ever be making that kind of a comparison. It's absolutely, the experiences are completely different. But when people say it wasn't that bad, it's put in a relative terms. One of the things that was important was that although it was incredibly hard and you are basically in a prison, at least you were with community. So that was one thing that made things a little bit tolerable, which is that you're going through this, but you're going through it with some members of your family, with some friends, people who, there are connections. The Japanese Canadian community has never been very big. And one thing I'm going to miss, my mother just turned 92 yesterday, and the one thing I'm going to miss when she passes away is being able to go to her and say, I just met Susan Ihoshi, and, I just mentioned the name, and she says, "Oh, she's got to be Barney's niece," right? And I'm constantly getting those comments from her. I give her a name, and she can tell me, "Oh, they probably related to somebody who lived down the street from us at Tashmi," right? So the community was there to support each other, and in that respect, it was tolerable. But that doesn't mean that it can be dismissed as not that bad an experience. There's an expression in Japanese, it's shikatakanai, and it translates as "it can't be helped." And that was their general response. They're faced with this, they don't have a choice, they have to get through it. And so, well, it can't be helped. And I didn't learn that until some years ago, but I kind of feel like that has been something that attitude has affected me all through my life. That's sort of the way I deal with problems. So release from the camps, and this is something that's important. The decision to release the Japanese Canadians from the camps was not something that the Canadian government would have done on its own. And as I become involved in political and social justice activism, I see this more and more. Governments, unfortunately, do not tend to effect positive change without a push. So the reason that they did it was that there was a building protest from both the general public and the media saying, this is not right. So they finally did make the decision to release Japanese Canadians from the camps, but as has been mentioned, so they were given three choices. The first choice was stay where you were in the camps. The second choice was go back to Japan, where most of them had never been. And the third choice was to move east across Canada away from the coast. As David mentioned, it was another 4 years before they would be allowed to move back to the coast. So the option that most of them chose was to migrate east across Canada. And this is something that's interesting. This was the creation of a second migrant class. Because normally what happens with immigration is first generation comes over, they find jobs, or they open businesses and create jobs, they buy houses, they establish themselves, and when the second generation comes along, they can build on that success. And until capitalism ruined everything, it was an expectation that each successive generation could look forward to a higher standard of living than their parents. That's no longer true, but that's a whole other discussion. But in the case of the Japanese Canadians, the internment created a second migrant class because they came out of the camps and they had to start completely over. They lost everything. They lost all their possessions, their houses, cars, fishing boats, businesses, as you mentioned, cameras and things like that. When they knew that they were going to be interned, some of them gave away their cars and cameras and things to friends just so that they wouldn't be, forfeited to the government. And all their things were sold off at bargain basement prices, and they were never able to get them back. One thing that was a real shock to me when I was researching an article for this 5 years ago was I was aware that they had lost the fishing boats as well as cars and businesses and houses, but what I didn't realize was that for a long time before the internment, before World War II, the Japanese fishing industry on the west coast in BC was regarded as a real threat, and the non-Japanese fishermen were trying to figure out what to do about it. So the internment was an opportunity for them to seize it. They got rid of their competitors, and you can bet that the people who bid for the fishing boats were people who were already in business. They moved east. They did their best to find, new jobs and new situations. Keep in mind that this was still while World War II was going on. So this was an incredibly difficult time because they were facing a tremendous amount of racism. And this is, again, something that my mother recounts when I referred to that person saying that the internment camp was not such a bad experience. For many people, what was worse was being thrust back out into society where they had their freedom, but now they were facing all this racism while they were still in the middle of this war. So my mother ended up at a private school, Alma College in St. Thomas, and she ended up meeting there was one other Japanese Canadian woman who was there who became her lifelong best friend. And they were able to attend the school in exchange for doing chores. So they would be, mopping floors. Imagine how that goes over in a mostly white private school where, a lot of these families are wealthy. And here's these two people of color, and they're in your classes, but they're also mopping floors, right? So this gets into a whole other stage of this experience, which has to do with trauma. And back then, people weren't talking about trauma, but there was a requirement that at age 16, Japanese Canadians registered for an identity card, and I believe it actually said enemy alien on it. So my mother had to take the train from St. Thomas, Ontario to London, which is where the closest RCMP office was, and register for this card. The RCMP officer was taking down the information, grabbed her face and turned it from side to side to look for identifying marks. And her horrible memory of this wasn't that, but it was being in high school a few days later, and in the middle of her class, an RCMP officer barged in, walked over to her desk, and placed the card down in front of her. And that is completely unnecessary, and that is an intimidation technique. That is, it's petty, it's spiteful. There's no reason why that card couldn't have been delivered to her home or sent in the mail. But this is something that we continue to see. And this is why it's really important for me to relate these experiences to what is happening, continues to happen today. When I got involved in 2004 in activism, it was supporting the Muslims who have been falsely accused of terrorism in Canada. And one thing that was a result of that, not even with the Muslims who were actually accused of plotting terrorism, but Muslims in general started to report being visited by CSIS agents at their place of business. So CSIS agents were coming in and demanding to interrogate them, which, by the way, they have no legal right to do. But this is done for one reason and one reason only. It is to intimidate, it's to cause problems. It's really what they're hoping for is that they're going to get people fired. Because what are you supposed to think if you're a boss and CSIS agents come into your business and interrogate one of your employees, right? So these are things that keep happening. The lasting effects of the internment. When the Japanese Canadians were released from the camps, they actually had a lot of discussions, and they talked about why they were singled out, why there was so much racism. It's always been true that racists hate to see any particular group congregating, speaking their own language, and so on. And so the Japanese Canadian community made these conscious efforts to avoid that. As they were leaving the internment camps, they said, assimilate into white society. Don't be seen congregating. Don't speak Japanese in public. My mom and her siblings would actually, in Toronto, say to their parents on the streetcar, don't speak Japanese. Do your best. Get good grades. Don't do anything that would allow anyone to criticize you. And I think that's the reason why there has been a lot of success in, the second generation Japanese Canadians really achieving a lot in their jobs and so on. That was part of the assimilation. But the effects of that are seen in our generation and beyond. Back then, there was a statistic that Japanese Canadians had the highest rate of intermarriage of any ethnic group, which was 90% or over, which is astounding. I think it's the same in the US. there is no community. So if you look at a map of North America, and you look at the West Coast where the Japanese first immigrated, all the major cities, Vancouver, Seattle, San Diego, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they all have a Japantown or a little Tokyo. Move east across North America where they were dispersed. And even in the largest cities, New York, Chicago, Toronto, there's no Japantown or little Tokyo because they settled there with the intention of not congregating. And so that's caused a real identity crisis for a lot of us. Banana syndrome, right? That's a joke within East Asian communities, but there's a certain element of truth to it. Yellow on the outside and white on the inside, right? So I grew up with this problem with identity, like who am I? I didn't really have any community. I didn't identify with community. It's been wonderful reestablishing ties, but it was very difficult working through that. So the other thing that is a problem, and not the fault of the community, but the historical records of this are pretty sparse. You can do a Google search, you can find out some details of the internment, but it's a real problem that a lot of it is oral history and a lot of it's being lost. As the first generation is virtually gone, as the second generation is dying off, a lot of these stories are being lost. They're not committed to paper anywhere. I've been told by people that the teaching of the facts of the Japanese-Canadian internment are optional in history class. It's up to the teacher. So that's problematic because, I've done a talk like this, had someone come up to me and say, oh, we studied Obasan in one of our classes. That's great, but that's the exception, not the norm. 1977, as has been mentioned, was the 100th anniversary of the first Japanese Canadian to come to Canada. And that year there was a lot of celebration, there were a lot of events throughout the year. The one that I remember most vividly is in Toronto there was a youth conference at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre. And youth came from across the country, and it was really wonderful to meet other people, to establish these connections. There were a lot of workshops and a lot of discussions. And that was when people started to actually talk, young people started to talk about the internment, saying, why don't we know about this? Why didn't you tell us about this? David Suzuki, who is actually one of the older sensei, in one of these discussions, chastised the first and second generations and said, you should have told us, you should have been talking about this. And it was one of my uncles actually who challenged him and said, when you've been through this kind of trauma, you don't talk about it. You want to forget about it. You do your best not to think about it. And so it wasn't until 77 that we really started to hear, a lot of us, details from our parents. My father never talked about it, and even after that, he was a very quiet man, and I don't think he ever mentioned it to me. But we had a lot of discussions with our mom. This is why I know the details that I'm able to recount to you. She did discuss it with us, but that was, an awakening for all of us. That was the first time that we were actually learning about it. And hence that was when people started to say, we need to do something about it. That was when the push for redress with the first and second generations actually began in earnest. And led to the fight for redress being won in 1988. Just very quickly though, again, the redress settlement was a copy of what happened in the US. I'm not convinced that it would have happened otherwise. It's almost identical to the US settlement. There was a public apology. There was $21,000 per person. I think in the US it was $20,000, something like that. But again, this is something that didn't happen without protest, without a fight and a struggle. And incidentally, the $21,000 was symbolic. It was a drop in the bucket compared to what they had really lost, which couldn't be replaced in terms of homes, businesses, and so on. The War Measures Act was repealed, and this is really one of the most important points because there was a lot of rejoicing from the Japanese Canadian community that the War Measures Act was repealed. The War Measures Act was what made it possible for our civil rights to be violated. It enabled police to arrest, detain, without charges, without evidence, without due process, no lawyers, and to imprison indefinitely, which normally is not legal anywhere, well, certainly in North America. So the War Measures Act was repealed, but what you have to realize is that when you take toys away from the government, all they do is they buy new ones. And so when I got involved in political activism in 2004, what we were fighting was something called security certificates, which there were five security certificate cases in Canada against Muslims who were accused of terrorism. I think there was a fight to try and defeat security certificates, but I don't think that was one, was it? No. So there still are a couple of people who are fighting security certificates. Guess what security certificates do? They allow arrest without evidence, without charges, indefinite imprisonment, no lawyers, no due process. So it's important to step back and realize all of that. Am I out of time? You should wrap. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can take questions. Thank you.
But what Kim said earlier about when the Japanese Canadians left Western Canada, they wanted to fly under the radar. They didn't want the attention. It makes so much sense that those organizations that I tried to contact didn't really want to get involved. Maybe that mindset was still there, and maybe it still is. So thank you for making that comment. And while I was sitting there, I had this kind of eureka. So
Thank you, Frank. That was great. Yes, to the back. Speak up and let us hear.
I just wanted to give some reasons, specific reasons why Japanese Canadians did not want to go back to Japan when they were asked to repatriate after the Harbor incident, or were asked to either go repatriate back to Japan or stay in Canada. Why are the reasons and why they wanted, specific reasons why they wanted to stay in Canada?
The majority of them were Canadian-born. Certainly, my parents' generation, the Nisei, they'd never been to Japan, so it was a foreign place. I mean, Japan was losing the war. It was the conditions there. It wasn't widely known, but certainly the people that ended up there discovered that Japan was a war-torn country, and it certainly didn't seem like a reasonable place to go to. I think certainly my parents, they just thought that was ridiculous. Why would they want to go there? So they came east.
For the first generation Japanese Canadians, they had made a big decision to move here, to start a new life here. So to reverse that and go all the way back was huge. And now it's not to say that they were all unanimous. There were, a lot of people who went back. Probably a lot of them were demoralized by the experience of the internment. But the other thing to remember is that they were now outsiders in Japan. So I'm not sure if they could have known this, but I've heard that a lot of the people who went back to Japan were actually treated quite badly when they got there.
The actual number of the Japanese Canadians who were sent to Japan in 1946 was 4,000 people. And then more than half of them were Canadian-born generation. And then before the war ended, 1945, March, the government forced Japanese Canadians to decide to stay here or to go back. By that research, the number of them registered to who wanted to go back to Japan was 15,000 out of 22,000. But by the next year, 46, when the deportation started 8th May, they, one by one after another, they wanted to change their mind to stay here because they, by that time, they knew that Japan was totally devastated. And then they received the letters that they don't come back now because the shortage of the food supply. That suffered because 3 millions of overseas Japanese who were overseas came back to Japan 1946, 7, 8. So that caused chaos in Japan. And so one more thing is for the Nisei people, Canadian-born generation, under 16, they had no choice. They had to follow their parents. Or above 16, there's a lot who decided to stay here, but younger Nisei people had to follow their parents' decision. So for them, I interviewed many Canadian-born generation who are still living there in Japan after the war, all through their life. They were still, that was the 1990s, they still carry that my identity is Canadian, Japanese Canadian. And they couldn't feel that they belong to Japan. And they call themselves, we are exiled.
I'm wondering how both of you feel about the way this history is portrayed in our National Museum, our History Museum, and I don't know, I haven't been to the Human Rights one in Winnipeg, but a second part is I noticed in the History Museum in Ottawa, there's a replica of a Japanese fishing boat, the Nishika Girl, which apparently was bought by an indigenous fisher who had fished with the owner, and he kept it for the owner for when he would be able to come back. And whether there was any more of that kind of solidarity between indigenous people and Japanese at that time.
I'm just going to take one more comment.
I have not been to those museums, so I really can't comment, but what concerns me is that our story, the story of Japanese Canadians, is told properly. As we've seen in tonight's talk, for example, I really am trying so hard not to use the government language of the time, which was described as an evacuation of the Japanese Canadians and the internment. And I really think it's the language of propaganda of the time, certainly, and because evacuation means you take someone from a dangerous place to a safe place, and that's not what happened for Japanese Canadians. And again, internment, you can't intern citizens of your own country. So the language is very misleading, so that's why I keep trying to emphasize it's uprooting and it was detainment, and east of the Rockies, the choice, it's dispersal. And I use that phrase, ethnic cleansing, because really in British Columbia, that's what happened. So I'd like to see that sort of language being used in the museums. Anyway.
Thank you. Kim, you want?
Yeah, I haven't been to the Human Rights Museum. I'd like to. I've heard some comments, maybe some minor controversies, but I'm not really sure myself. There was an exhibit last year, and I can't remember whether it was ROM or AGO.
Wrong.
ROM? Okay. Yeah, these pieces of artwork, which were really interesting, but everyone I talked to said the same thing, which was, it was put into an existing gallery, and the pieces were sandwiched between the permanent exhibits. Wow. So it was really weird. It was like going in on a scavenger hunt. It was like walking around and around.
That was very deliberate, sorry. They consulted with the community. In fact, that exhibit, its first iteration, the first consultation with the community, I just happened to be part of. And we were very upset because that's exactly what was happening. They were using the language, the internment. They deliberately put it in the Canadiana gallery because they wanted it to be part of Canadian history. So I thought that was a very good idea that we, in addition to seeing General Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham, they were telling the story of Japanese Canadians. So I thought it was very powerful. So they consulted with members of the, and then they delayed the opening by over a year, and then that's why it appeared in that form, which I thought was very powerful.
This business of not going back to Japan, it seems to me that we need to understand why the Japanese population, why it was here in the first place. Is there something about where they came from in Japan, or their particular economic circumstances that brought them here in the first place? You know, it's not, obviously they weren't just tourists. They were coming because they were driven in many ways by circumstances back home. You know, I just wonder if there's any clues you can give us on that side of it.
Despite all our beliefs in multiculturalism and all that good propaganda words, actually the experience of the Japanese Canadian or the Chinese Canadians or the indigenous people really are not well known. But I'm here to actually say I have been an activist in the Chinese Canadian community for a long time, and we were painfully aware of what Japanese Canadians went through, and we were tremendously inspired when you got together, despite all odds, despite all the difficulty within the community and the pressure from outside, that you inspired us. I just wanted you to hear this. And it's the same way that we have to build solidarity with folks like here, like David, and a lot of the people here in the labor movement. That's the only way we can move forward, because no matter how much we hold forums and talk about this, the outside world, they have no idea what their own history is, actually collective history. They have no clue. They like to believe the best of what the government says. And look at this, I used to be on the school board, and during the days in the 90s, I see John Doherty and I were on the school board at the same time. And we held conferences for students to point out to what's happening in South Africa, what happened to the Japanese community, what happened to the Chinese community, and kind of hoping that the students would get that outside of the classroom. So there is hope, and I just want to say how much what you guys went through was an inspiration for us.
I'm fourth generation. My dad's family was relocated to Manitoba from BC. And I've just been reconnecting with some of my cousins in Winnipeg over the past summer. It's been really nice, but sharing stories about our experiences with us and our parents. There's like 4 uncles, 3 aunts, and all of them have, like me and the cousins were realizing we all have these mental health issues that we're struggling with, these substance abuse issues that we're all struggling with, and like we're a party, which is awesome. But we're sort of coming to terms with this, and we're looking at our parents and we're seeing that they all have struggled with the same sort of things. I was just wondering if this is sort of a pattern, especially because the conversation around mental health and emotional health is changing. It's becoming a lot more open. I'm just wondering if this is something with Japanese Canadians that you may have come across in any of your research, if you've seen anything about that, and if this might be another unspoken trauma for a new generation.
Japanese Canadians for Social Justice has been working to address that specifically. We've done a couple events which have dealt with mental health within our community, and what's the expression? Historical trauma? Post-traumatic. No. Sorry.
Say it out loud.
Intergenerational trauma. Thank you very much. Yeah. So, this is all new to me because I still feel it, but I think a lot of people do. And when we've had these events, there's been a lot of really good sharing of of experiences and stories and resources. And one of our members, who's sitting in the corner there, Mariko, runs a journaling group. And you might want to talk to her because she's been working on that specifically, sort of journaling as therapy, right?
Well, Joy Kogawa, she started it. So a few of us would get together and journal together and kind of explore mental health issues and mental health, actually. So yeah, as Kim said, we had 2 events recently in the past year. One was a closed circle of 10 people, deep sharing, and then we had a more public event. Just like, that was our last event, like just a few weeks ago. We're also, we went to a meeting to talk to Hong Fook, which is an Asian mental health organization. They have services for Chinese and Filipino Canadians and some other groups, but not Japanese Canadians. So we were kind of building that bridge. So yeah, if anyone's interested, I'm around and we can talk.
The one thing that's really important to me about Japanese Canadians for Social Justice is it's about supporting other communities. It's been really frustrating to me to see Japanese Canadians saying, well, that doesn't concern us because that's not part of our community. And that's actually why JCSJ was formed in the first place. In terms of why people came from Japan in the first place, history is actually my weak point, so I actually don't know the history of Japan well, but my understanding is that when the Issei immigrated from Japan, it was because they really were looking for a better life. Conditions were not the way they are today.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why the Japanese Canadian community is so small is that now there's not that much reason for Japanese to immigrate to Canada. They're certainly not doing it for a higher standard of living. But it was opposite back then.
Yeah. I was just going to say that the reason why they came was like, it's the same reason why most immigrants come, because of poverty, lack of job opportunities, and in a lot of the immigrants, the fishing community, so the ones that ended up coming, there just were no opportunities any longer in these tiny little villages. And so they came seeking a better life. So that too would explain, as Kim said earlier, that why they wouldn't want to necessarily go back to Japan. So I wanted to mention one other thing quickly. We're talking about the reception of Japanese Canadians coming back east. And one of the things that I read in Ken Adachi's book that was just shocking to me, because last month was Black History Month, so I was being aware of a lot of the obstacles that Black Canadians and Americans had faced. But can you imagine, so some Japanese Canadians were hired in Niagara to work on the fruit and the orchards there. And so Ken Adachi describes how in, I think it was 1943, residents of Beamsville burned a cross at the entrance to a farm that had hired Japanese Canadians. I mean, it was just appalling. But it just also goes to show how ignorant people can be. I mean, they're following that sort of mindset. Because the other thing that just kills me is how, and Joy herself in the book, she referred to it as, oh, you speak such good English. Like, people had no idea what Japanese Canadians were really like. They believed that they were these caricatures of the buck-toothed, you know, the fifth party, or what is it, the
cartoons.
Yeah, the cartoons.
The cartoons that were common back then. I forgot all about them.
And my aunt had the same experience. She met a Canadian soldier when she was coming east on the train, and he said, oh, I've never met a Japanese person before. You speak such a good English. Well, she was born here, so, you know, and educated here. So it just, I think that was one reason why that they were able to assimilate once they did establish themselves. But I'd just like to make one last comment, which is the great thing about for me personally, connecting with this community. Yes, there's trauma, and yes, there's a lot of baggage that we carry. But for me personally, it's so wonderful to finally be able to say, these are my people. I've no other Japanese Canadians besides my own cousins and my brother, and it's just amazing. I have Japanese Canadian friends. I mean, to me, that's unheard of, because it's not that I didn't want any when I was a kid. There weren't any. So, thank you.
Oh, no, that was wonderful.
Sorry, could I just?
Yeah. Just, I'm going to ask about this guy wanted to get up. No use? Yes. We've been waiting for you.
Just a few brief comments. I remember being out on the British Columbia coast a few years ago. I went to a smaller museum on the Sunshine Coast, and it spoke of what it termed the ethnic cleansing of the Japanese Canadians, the ethnic cleansing of the Japanese Canadians. And it went over the Japanese Canadians who had lived in that area. So I thought that's very interesting to see, because it says it as it is. Elsewhere in British Columbia, I was disappointed in places that I thought should have known better, where they showed pictures of the history of the community, as it was in British Columbia in the past, but it was always the Japanese, the Japanese, the Japanese. Never anything about them being Canadian. And I think for us who are here, the central issue is we are Canadians. This was not being deported, this was being exiled and banished. Canadians being exiled and banished by other Canadians, by our Canadian government. And I think this is what impinges on Muslims in Canada, people of minority status, that, oh yeah, how do you like Canada? We are Canadians. This is our home and native land, and it has been for generations. We are Sansei. There are now Yonsei and Gosei. And when we speak about intergenerational trauma, one of the things, and this is only anecdotal, about speaking to Yonsei, the generation beyond me, where do we go if we want to talk about this? If we feel difficulty with this, where do we go? You can't go to Japanese Family Services because they cater to the newcomers. They cater to the newcomers. They operate in Japanese. They have a deep sense of what it is in Japan and what people bring with them. They don't have a sense of what Japanese Canadians have gone through the generations. So I think that's something that we as the Japanese Canadian community have to look at for our fourth and fifth generations. We're far different from the people back in Japan. As you said, over 90% of us are intermarried. And that's a whole identity issue for young people. What am I? Who am I? Where am I coming from? What is my background? And that's an area of great tension. Just being Japanese Canadian from Japanese background poses one set of issues, but then to see Yonsei and Gosei going through additional layers of issues to work with, it will be very important for our community to help them address that. And I look at people like Jun and Stefan who are here today, or friends of my own daughter.
Oh.
Thank you.
So yes, Gene said, like he said, I am his daughter's friend. I'm part of a group called Young Japanese Canadians in Toronto. Kota did mention it at the beginning. So basically, when we talk about intergenerational trauma, like you said, like Susan said, also, it's all about like coming together as a community and talking about it. And I think community groups such as Young Japanese Canadians in Toronto, it allows young people who are Japanese, young Japanese Canadian or Nikkei identifying people to meet other people like them that are young. Because like people have said, like the community is pretty small, pretty spread out. We don't really know each other other than our families, and it's good to have people that you don't know that are young to talk to. So if you'd like to learn more about our group, feel free to let me or Stefan know.
Oh yes. I just wanted to respond quickly to previous question about the why Japanese people left to come to Canada. I mean, obviously can't speak to like individual instances of why people chose to migrate, but from the late 19th century to early 20th century, there's big transformation happening in Japanese society. There's a lot of distrust in the countryside. It was, you know, this is probably the right audience, I'm not sure, but there's a transition from feudalism to capitalism. So, you know, there's, like Susan was saying, there's lots of poverty and people like displaced from their land, and you know, similar to what was happening in England when the capitalism started there, and you know, similar to what indigenous people experienced in Canada, the process of what Marx said, primitive accumulation. So that's sort of, I think, the broader general context, and this is why sort of this kind of systematic analysis is also important.
Thank you. So we're just going to do a few more wrap-up comments. Frank, did you want to add something?
I wanted to add something to what Tam had talked about. Just for your information, the Toronto Workers' History Project puts on monthly events, monthly presentations. And on October 13th, we're having one on Chinese Canadians in Toronto. And I've been in touch with Justin, who's the CCNC TO Executive Director, and I did suggest 4 names that might be interesting: Olivia Chow, Chuck Kwan, there was one other name, and the 4th one was, of course, Tam Goosen. So he may well be in contact with you, and you may be part of the presenters for our event.
Before we move to the last 2 speakers, I just do want to also make one quick comment on this commentary on why the Japanese came here. Let's not let the Canadian industrialists and the Canadian state off the hook here. As I said earlier, in the 1800s, they were looking for cheap labor. Who built our railway and who died building our railway? The mighty Chinese Canadians. The Japanese Canadians were brought similarly to work. I mean, Stevenston was a canning factory town for the fishing industry, where a lot of Japanese Canadians worked. So again, a lot of them were recruited, as were the Eastern Europeans later. And then, of course, the people who had been here first then objected to their jobs being taken away. The come-from-away syndrome. By the way, for the older generation, it was the Prot-Catholic battles. The Prots who came here first thought the Catholics were taking their jobs and other things. So again, we've had this history in Canada, but a lot of it comes from you can call it capitalism, you can call it the Canadian state's plan to develop our economy, and this is part of our history that we need to acknowledge as well. Now, I just want to at least thank both Susan and Kim for their contribution, and Joy for her contribution tonight. And just to allow... We have gifts for both Susan and Kim. And I hope we have one for Joy, too. And then, Susan, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, not really.
Okay, no, not to worry. And please don't forget, there's wonderful copies of Susan's book at the back, signed by the author. We would like you to get some. And Kim, if you'd like to finish up.
Just 2 quick comments. One, people are interested in the events that we're putting on and looking at the connections. We have our email list, right? Sign up? Okay, right there at the back. So if you want to get on our email list, it's there. There's also a Facebook page, although it's confusing because there's another group with the same name. I think we haven't straightened it out. And lastly, just, you know, the lessons about racism and stereotyping people and so on. And I keep thinking about it now with all the coronavirus stuff and seeing that apparently some countries are restricting entry to people who are Chinese. I think that's the last 8, most recent 8 cases in Toronto are through the outbreak in Iran. You know, so like the focus is always so misplaced, and it's always based on race and stereotype. So just something to be aware of. Quick more questions.
And no, I know this is going to occur tomorrow. We always try to finish by 9. I listen just to say to you, thanks so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate your presence, and safe travels home.